was having a dream much like any other I'd had before. There was some loosely strung together plot, apparently only in retrospect. Somewhere I had to be, an object of my pursuit that seemed to elude and taunt me. I moved forward without understanding why. There were people around me, and who those people were changed without warning, and sometimes I was no longer acting, but instead watching myself act as if viewing some abstract and esoteric film. That all changed when I found his wallet. It was brown leather, worn and scuffed from many years of going into back pockets, then back out, from being tossed on the counter when he got home, from being sat on. It was sitting in a puddle under a bridge I did not recognize and could not find again if I needed to. I picked it up and turned my head, looking for whomever it could belong to, noticing, only then, that I was alone. The faceless and shifting and impermanent throng of dream travelers was no longer with me. It was gray January and gentle rain fell everywhere except under the cover of the bridge, and the wallet was damp with cold, and I was alone holding it. There was money inside the wallet, red and blue bills with faces on them that I did not recognize. Strange, nonsense denominations, a 6 note, a 30, 1,000 units of whatever currency this was. My instinct told me to take some, just one of those dream thoughts you have no control over. I stuffed a few bills in my side pocket. I remember a moment of pause. I realized I was wearing an old pair of cargo pants that, in reality, are sitting in the back corner of my closet, unthought of for some time. His ID was in the front flap behind a thin plastic film. His name was Harold Haying Harris, and he was smiling like he knew something. Something about me. I decided I didn't want the wallet and dropped it in the puddle where I'd found it. Strange dreams often stay with you for a few moments upon waking. At least that's how it is for me. Usually I come back with only a few pieces. I lay in bed, hesitate to move or change anything, scared that motion will draw me further into the waking world. All I ever want is to go back to sleep. I live my days in anticipation of that moment, climbing into bed, pulling the covers up until they cover my mouth and nose, breathing my own exhales, the way your body eventually starts to dissolve. You feel heavy, half paralyzed. There's a comforting warmth as your stomach goes up and down with each breath, drawn autonomically. Laying there, trying to preserve my comfort, that's usually when other pieces of the dream return. That night, it was still dark, somewhere in the quiet moments preceding twilight. I lay, thinking about where I'd just been. Somewhere familiar in many ways, the dark evergreens, the gunmetal sky, but not anywhere I'd ever actually been. Likely not a place that truly exists, I thought, just a creation of my mind. I remembered the rain, how cold it had been. I thought about the puddle and suddenly I remembered the wallet, the strange bills, Harold's picture. I could see it so vividly, could see his name. I rolled over in my bed to face the window. It's always been my theory that if you want to fall back into the dream you've just woken from, your best bet is to stay in the same position. Don't move a muscle. Close your eyes and let yourself drift back to the place you just left. I imagine it has something to do with blood pooling in certain areas of the brain. Our thoughts occupy physical space inside our head. The things our imaginations conjure are not entirely intangible. A lot of people don't get that. I had no desire to go back into that dream. Feared it. So I turned over, hoping that would help. Icy rain pelted my window in wind-driven bursts. Every time I closed my eyes, my thoughts returned to the dream. Walking in a crowd, pursuing some undefined thing that was just beyond my ability to recall, finding the wallet, Harold Haying Harris. I sat up in bed. I have enough experience falling in and out of the same nightmare to know how this was going to go unless I did something to stop it. What you need in those moments is an interruption. Get out of bed, go to the bathroom, get some water, walk around for a minute. Anything that functions as a reset. After making the circuit, bathroom, kitchen, back to bed, I decided to check my phone. I don't remember seeing what time it was. I don't even remember opening Google and typing in his name. I suppose I thought it might help to quickly confirm what I already knew, that Harold was not a real person, that he was simply a thought inside my head. What I found was his blog. It was a WordPress site. They're easy to identify. The one I built to post my writings years ago had a similar layout. Nearly 100 entries, each with his name at the top. There was a small picture next to his name in the byline. The same picture from his wallet. The same smile. I turned on my bedroom light and waited for sunrise. Harold appeared to be some sort of lifestyle blogger. That's as close as I can get to describing what I found. He lived in a city called Cadesh and wrote about his days there. I skimmed the entries. Most were boring. Quote, "Today I went for a lovely walk down 21st Street. The leaves are beginning to turn. If you're looking for a delicious cup of coffee in the area, consider..." End quote. Stuff like that. A few, though, were strange. I began to wonder if there might be something wrong with Harold. Some sort of condition, and if his blog might best be viewed as almost voyeuristic insight into the mental degradation of a sick man. Quote, "Earlier today, in the gray hours of the morning, all the birds fell out of the sky in unison. Did anyone else see this?" End quote. I was ready to stop reading until I stumbled upon that line. I kept scrolling to see if it was an outlier. I found others. This one buried at the end of a long entry about the best thrift stores located on the sleepy Main Strip. Quote, "I noticed the cashier from Second Chances following me to each subsequent store I visited. He was hiding behind a clothing rack in exchange. I found him sitting alone in a locked dressing room in Moonlight Jewels. I'm worried he may have followed me home. I took a much longer and less straightforward path back to my place, but couldn't shake the feeling that someone was behind me, lagging just far enough back to stay out of sight. He made me very uncomfortable, and I don't think I will be returning to the store, despite their excellent selection of second-hand cutlery and china." End quote. Each post contained a link to a map which traced his path. Places where he stopped, like restaurants and bakeries, and shops were noted. I zoomed out from one of these maps, curious to see where in the world Kadesh was located, and was disturbed to know it was in my state, not far away from my home. I'd nearly driven past it many times. It was north and west of me, close to the Pacific Ocean. Strange that I'd never heard the name before. I checked the map on my phone, comparing it to Harold's. I zoomed closer and closer, but where Cadesh was on his map was nothing but empty green space on mine. A featureless spot in the woods with no roads and no shops and nothing else of note except for a small lake. The lake was on both maps. I found an entry of Harold's which involved it. Quote, "Walked to Cressman Lake today. There's a bench at the edge of the water where I like to sit. You'll find a lot of flat stones at the base of this bench, perfect for skipping across the glass-like surface of the water. It's a good place to spend an afternoon when you need to clear your mind. I worry that he will return soon. I see him in my dreams." End quote. The lake, Cressman, to him, unnamed, to me, was a 90-minute drive from my house. I had no plans for the day, nothing to stop me from filling it with 3 hours of driving round trip, plus however much time I would spend at the lake. Doing what? Looking for him? I didn't stop to think. I opened my closet and packed a few change of clothes, quickly, feeling an urgent need to get on my way. Logic would necessitate that all I needed were the clothes on my back for such a trip. That makes me wonder if I knew, even then, what I was going to find. If I knew somewhere in that part of my brain which can't speak, not out loud at least, where I was going. The first hour of the drive was navigating from my residential street to the highway and then heading due north. It was the same boring, uneventful drive I'd done hundreds, if not thousands of times. I chased bright blue skies up the round of the earth. It was an unseasonably beautiful day, blue and gold with viciously cold wind. The weather lifted my spirits. It was easy to forget what I was doing. The mountain was on my right, slowly falling behind me with each mile I drove. I watched its white, snowy bulk travel from my passenger window to the rear window to the rear windshield before vanishing altogether. It was time to head west. 2 miles further along the road I'd exited to, a nondescript state road with numbers for a name, my GPS commanded me to turn right onto an unnamed, unmarked dirt road that carved a path through gray, barren trees. I could see that it went straight for a few hundred feet before curving, out of sight, to the left. The road was wide enough for one car and full of dips that shook me from side to side as I passed over them, going no more than 10 miles per hour. Somewhere along this road, which connected with so many others just like it that I lost count, lost sense of which direction I'd been turned in, then turned out of, and then turned back around into. Clouds filled the sky, blocking out the sun, making it feel much more like the January afternoon it was. And then I saw it, just ahead, the lake. I parked my car in a dirt turnaround and walked to the water. No wind blew. Likewise, the lake sat still and silent, patient. The color of the sky, a perfect imitation of what sat above me, equally as still, as if buried in the dirt was some grotesquely massive-looking glass. I began to walk its circumference clockwise. The day was quiet. Nothing moved. I heard birdsong off in the distance, but saw no birds. The only other sound was the destruction of whatever crunched beneath my feet with every step. Every time I rounded another turn, I would tell myself that it was time to turn back. My feet would continue forward, and I would convince myself that one more corner was what I needed. I knew that just around the next tree there would be something for me. Something that was waiting just for me. I continued this way until I found myself on the opposite side of the wide lake, miles from where I'd parked. There was no way to mark the descent of the sun, save the gradual dulling of the light, the curtaining of the hidden day. I turned back, bitterly disappointed. I've no idea how long I walked, because, despite retracing my steps, the lake and its shore providing the surest guide any wanderer could hope for, I failed to reach my car, where it should have been. And of this, I am also sure. The empty dirt patch of my arrival was unmistakable, as were my own so recently treaded tire tracks. Stood now only a forlorn bench, and at its 4 iron feet, a pile of disc-shaped rocks. I sat and attempted to slow my racing mind. I felt, after a few moments of slow, steady breathing, the strangest sense of comfort and normality. Darkness overtook the sky. I had no car, no sense of where I was. Even my phone was gone, sitting, still, presumably, in the cup holder where I had left it. And yet I did not panic. I felt certain there was nothing to fear. I should have known better. There was light in the distance, glowing beyond the far side of the lake, city lights polluting the dark sky. I saw them on the clouds and reflected on the black surface of the water, which had become otherwise indistinguishable from the solid ground on which I sat. I stood and began my dark journey back again around the lake, hoping that some unknown grace would prevent me from wading into a cold, lonely death. The city looked as I imagined it. A delicate mist hung around the streetlights. People walked past each other on the sidewalk with their heads down, mostly in pairs or alone. I stumbled into a greenway, entering the tree line where the city ended. There was a gazebo with string lights wrapped around the wood lattice. A couple embraced in that spotlighted podium. Storefronts lined the main strip, all with their orange lights projecting warmth upon the shivering sidewalk. Somewhere, someone roasted peanuts. I felt welcome despite no one noticing me. There are said to be events so shocking that one could not face them and remain unchanged. Events which, due to their nature, their magnitude, their substance, taint the immortal spirit of man and make him forever after something different. Unsurvivable moments. I'm not speaking of moments which stay the beating heart or disconnect the corporeal from the inanimate. I say unsurvivable to say that there is a dividing line, a place in the gray where one can clearly separate white from black and say, without question, the person I once was no longer exists. I found myself facing such a moment not longer after entering this lost city beyond the trees. I walked along the town's central road slowly, stopping to gaze at the items displayed in shop windows or to watch the people tromping aimlessly up and down the sidewalk. The first store I entered was a sweet shop. The purveyor was a kindly older woman, and the walls were lined with clear buckets of candy with turnstile bottoms. What I noticed first was the lack of recognizable brands. Even the packaged candy sitting on shelves was bland and generic. There was no names on any of the labels, no familiar logos. I stretched my hand beneath one of the buckets and twisted the knob one time, loosening some multicolored hard candy from its cage, which I placed immediately into my mouth. It had no taste. The woman behind the register, her face ruddy and beaming, stared straight forward and seemed not to notice me. Back on the sidewalk, a familiar pair passed me. Familiar because they'd walked past me once before, heading the opposite direction. They were a couple of indeterminate sex, arm in arm, their heads bent forward as if against an agitating wind. The air was still and the evening quiet. I crossed the street and entered what appeared to be a record store. It was dark inside. Dim, yellow globe lamps hung from the ceiling, casting meager spotlights onto each aisle. On the back of the store, a familiar, vocalless melody played softly. I wandered slowly up the first aisle, trying to determine the genre of the section. It was labeled alphabetically. I stopped where appropriate, looking for more names I would recognize, finding none. Upon finally making it to the back wall, I searched for the owner, or at least whomever was tending the store. There was a long counter which ran through the length of the wall. Behind the counter was an open door. This back room was the source of that familiar melody. Someone was moving around in there. I could see his shadow. I opened my mouth to call out for assistance, but an alarming sense of foreboding stole over me, silencing me at once. I left quickly. On the sidewalk again, the same couple walked past, bent forward determinedly. I was beginning to feel uncomfortable. In this veritable ghost town, I myself was a spectral figure, and worse yet, I was stuck here, unable to leave, with no one knowing where to look for me or even that I was gone. With the reality of my situation settling in, I began to walk quickly back the way I'd come. I cannot speak with certainty about my intentions because I did not make it far, although it seems to me now, in retrospect, that I was heading for the woods again. The lake, which, while dark and cold and ominous in its own right, was at least a lonely place, and anywhere felt safer in that moment than this strangely populated strip, and total solitude seemed better company than these reactionless, empty people who seemed to contain no purpose, no vivacity, no animation whatsoever. Something compelled me to turn to my left and gaze in the lit window of the final store before rounding the corner which would have taken me back to the town green, the gazebo, and the tree line. It was a second-hand store named Second Chances. I recognized the name at once from Harold's writing. A man stood behind the register, smiling, his eyes locked on mine. He saw me. For the first time since entering Cadesh, I was certain that someone was aware of me. How I wished in that moment for the complete anonymity I so fully dreaded just minutes before. I wanted nothing more than for this man not to see me, for him to have never seen me. I turned, prepared to run for the trees, hoping with every ounce of my being that he would not jump over the counter and give chase. What greeted me upon turning back drove that thought entirely from my mind. The townspeople had stopped pacing. They'd ceased wandering aimlessly. All stood completely still. In unison, their heads turned to me, slowly, like a hive mind that had become aware of the interloper. I darted around the corner, horribly aware as I turned my head that they intended to follow. I ran without looking back. ran in fear that one might catch me before I reached the tree line, in fear that this tree line might lack the talismanic quality which I was placing upon it, a safe haven, somewhere I would be untouchable. A man leapt from an alleyway, intercepting me. Before I had a chance to defend myself, I was being dragged into the darkness. A hand placed over my mouth to stifle my screams. He whispered into my ears, trying to calm me. And then we were backing into a door, which he slammed shut and locked behind us. We were in a storage room with boxes stacked high along one wall, and a bare metal shelf containing all sorts of tools. "You'll be safe in here," he said. It was Harold, the man I dreamed about. I struggled to speak, backing away toward the locked door. "Don't," he said. "Let me out of this room," I said. "You're safer here." "Why should I believe you care about my safety? Who are you?" "I thought you would know," he said, speaking more to himself than me. Something pounded viciously on the door behind me, making me jump. It was the townspeople, still set, apparently, on hunting me. "Come on, upstairs," said Harold. I paused, but only for a moment. I did not trust Harold, not entirely, but there was something kind and friendly about his face. The dream tried to return to me, or perhaps a different dream. Everything was mixed up inside my mind, trying to congeal and present a formed picture. The savage beating at the door is what decided for me. I didn't trust it would hold. I followed Harold up a wooden staircase, emerging in the lobby of a small inn. He grabbed the key from a post where it hung among many others, and then rushed me up another set of stairs, and then another. We stopped at room 306. He unlocked it, handed me the key, and shoved me inside. "Don't come out till morning. Draw your blinds. If anyone knocks at the door, be silent, and keep it locked." He shut the door on my face. The room was small, one twin bed and an old dresser of stained wood. A desk underneath the curtained window held a reading lamp, sheets of paper, and a pen. I stood over it a moment, tried the pen in my hand. It was warm, as if only recently leaving a strong hand set to accomplish something significant. I wrote my name on the paper. I wrote Harold's name on the paper. I wrote his full name. I wrote it again. On the bed, I found the bag that I'd packed that morning. Last I'd seen it, it had been in the back of my now missing car. My keys sat on the dresser. I passed the night sitting at the desk, holding the pen. The sun rose behind the heavy curtains. I had no way of knowing. At some point, I must have dozed because I awoke with a start to someone knocking on my door. It was Harold. I wondered if his directive the night before applied to him. Without knocking the door, I asked him what he wanted. "It's safe now," he said. "You can come out." I changed, thankful for the extra clothes I'd packed. Curious, too, to see the familiar old cargo pants I'd been wearing in my dream, and followed him downstairs. He left me alone in the lobby as he went into a back room. I glanced furtively over my shoulder, afraid that one of my pursuers might appear. Harold returned, carrying a plate. "Free breakfast for all guests," he said, setting the plate on the table. On the plate was a fluffy Belgian waffle with a large slice of butter melting in the center, 2 eggs, fried, and 2 pieces of bacon that looked like they'd seen the hot side of a skillet for no more than 10 seconds. "I know you want it," he said with a smile as I stood, hesitating. That he was correct is what made me most uncomfortable. I tried to understand how this strange man knew what my mother used to make me for breakfast every year on my birthday. The first bite caused tears to swell in my eyes. That's not an exaggeration. I wanted to cry because I had not tasted this waffle prepared with her own homemade batter. I tasted the vanilla and the cinnamon in nearly 10 years. Not since the cancer had ripped her away from me, from the world, before we were ready to lose her. Without pause, I dropped my fork and stood, looking over his shoulder. Harold had been standing over me, watching me eat, smiling to the room from which he'd emerged. "Is she here?" I asked him. The absurdity was not lost on me, but certain sensations can drive rational thought from the brain. Am I dreaming? Is this real? "Is who here?" There was genuine puzzlement on his face. My mother, this is hers, I said, pointing at the food. Something clicked. I could see it on his face. Interesting, he said. I had no idea. It is a terrific waffle. I have one every morning. The patron barged through the wide front doors. Instantly, I was on guard. I backed away from the table and stood next to Harold. He doesn't see you, he said. Most days, he doesn't even see me. The man, not one of the townspeople I'd seen last night, but similar in some way I struggled to identify, walked through the lobby, head down, and rounded the corner. He disappeared up the stairs. I could trace his path to the sound of his steps. He's going to his room. He'll stay up there for... Harold checked his watch. 90 minutes or so. Then he'll come back down, back out that same door, and he'll walk to the hardware store on 6th. He won't buy anything. Not anymore. He'll walk to aisle 17, inspect a ball-peen hammer, put it back on the shelf, confused, and leave. Then kill a few hours pacing Maine, and be back here before nightfall. He said this as if it bored him. Where's my car? I'm leaving. It's around the block where I parked at. Come on, I walk with you. There's something I'd like to show you before you go. I followed Harold outside, not without trepidation. I was still fearful of the angry mob which had seemed hell-bent on spilling my blood not 12 hours earlier. Harold, in direct contrast, carried himself with a nonchalant inattention, one that I envied. It was as if nothing in this entire world could surprise him. No contingency could strike which he was not totally prepared to encounter. Pause this way, he said, starting up the sidewalk. A few people lingered in the town square or in the gazebo. In the distance, I saw the familiar drones tracking the central strip. They looked just as they had the night before, mindless, purposeless. They've already forgotten, he said, as if my thoughts were being broadcast at full volume. So long as he doesn't see us, they won't. Harold grabbed my arm and stopped me from rounding the corner. It would have taken us past the wide windows of Second Chances, the thrift store with the menacing cashier. We ducked into the alleyway from last night. It took me a moment to recognize it in the daylight, and cut back out to the main strip a few buildings later. Who is he? What a good question, he said with a humorous laugh. I was hoping you might know. 2 blocks away, we reached my car. If this is Ed, I'm glad we met, he said, extending his hand. I took it out of reflex. His was warm, his grip strong. I truly never thought we would. The words bubbled up to my mouth before I had a chance to consider them. Come with me, I said. You don't belong here. Harold laughed. It was the same laugh I was coming to expect from him. He looked at his feet, arms crossed over his chest, and said one of the saddest things I'd ever heard. If I belonged elsewhere, I'd be there. You're not like them, I said, gesturing to the faceless many, the wanderers, the empty-souled horde that crawled the street without purpose. I used to think that, but I'm more like them than I am like you. I know that now. I could get in that car just to prove a point, but as soon as you left these dirt roads, and I could get you there another way, as soon as you got close to your roads, the ones you know, I would melt away. I'd be back here, in my inn, with my counterparts. Says who? I asked. The answer was forming in my mind, but I needed Harold to say it. The rest came as soon as he did. It's you, he said. Always you. I convinced Harold to get in the car and test his theory. Frankly, it didn't require much effort on my part. He was desperate to leave. His conviction that our attempt would be fruitless was not something to stand in his way. I want you to leave, I told him, accelerating towards the town square. He put his hand on my arm and directed me to turn right at the next intersection. Yes, he said, once again sensing my thoughts. Even in the car, he'll notice us, and it will be last night all over again, except this time we'll have to wait them out much longer. We took the long way, circumventing second chances in Dennis. I remember his name now, remember the people he'd hurt, and how he'd hurt them. How I'd made him hurt them. That is, unfortunately, not how it works, Harold said, returning to my original statement. How do you know that? Call it a hunch, I guess. Intuition. You probably know a better word for it than I do. Emerging safely beyond the thrift store, we had just a short way to go before entering the woods. In the road ahead of us stood a young woman. She stared vacantly up at the sky, the sun, her mouth ajar with drool running from one corner of her mouth. Tears streamed down from her eyes, painting her emotionless face with a glossy shimmer. I've never seen one do that, Harold said. They get worse every day. We drove for a while, leaving paved roads for the rutted and bouncy dirt path. I no longer needed his guidance, these trails being the architecture of my own design, before I heard him mutter, ostensibly to himself, As do I. I want you to leave, I repeated. I said it over and over, hoping it would be enough. We were getting close to the edge, rounding the lake now. What's his deal, anyway? Harold asked. Dennis. I never figured that out. He's sadistic. Causing pain gives him pleasure. I was never sure why. I thought I was close at one point, something to do with his relationship with his father, some commingling of abuse and comfort, that ugly cycle. But then that felt trite, so I gave up. I always give up when it gets hard. I'm sorry for that. Harold said nothing to this. I understand if you're angry. The strange part is, I know you're not. You don't have that in you. I looked to my right. The seat was empty. I rolled down my window and stuck my head out. The air was fresher. The sky above me was more vibrant. I was out. All I had to do was drive forward, leave the woods, get back to the highway, do my best to forget about them. I'd done it before. I knew it was possible. What stopped me was Harold's sad words bouncing around my mind. If I belonged somewhere else, I'd be there. I left my car where Harold had parked it and retraced my route, careful to avoid Dennis's watchful eyes and the alerting effect they had on the townspeople, to the inn. He was sitting at the table where he'd served me breakfast, staring at his hands. I'll do it, I said. I don't know how, but I'm going to make it happen. We went upstairs to the room I'd spent the night in. This time, Harold came in with me and shut the door behind us. He sat on the edge of the bed, and I took my seat at the desk. I took the pen in my hand, put it back, looked down upon the blank page. It was, as I always knew it to be, inviting, appealing in its own unique, indescribable way, but intimidating, enticing me and making a mockery of me all at once. It knew my deficiencies, but didn't even have the decency to state them outright. It made me do that, forced me to bring them to prominence with each stroke of the pen. I tried, more than once, Harold said. I thought maybe you'd put enough of yourself in me that I might be able. I'm not exactly well read, you know that, but I know things. I know a lot. That's one of the biggest tropes, isn't it? The main character being a stand-in for the author. I know I'm not you, not exactly, but there are certain undeniable similarities. It's only natural. I pretended to be deep in thought, staring down at the ream of paper he'd left for me, only because I could think of no reply. It was an upsetting thought. That piece of me, and how big a piece, had been left behind in this place, to rot, to fester, to fade into obscure, half-remembered recollections that only appeared in the occasional dream, forgotten before even having the chance to settle into their rightful place in my mind. It's hard, Harold said. It's really hard. I can't say I like it, the frustration. I'm just never able to see it right. The things I see up here, I see them so vividly, and always I come up here and sit at that desk, so excited, so ready to put it down on paper, but as soon as the pen is in my hand and it's time to do the damn thing, it's like, I don't know, like it all goes somewhere else, somewhere I can't see it. The more you chase it, the more it runs. I told him. It's like when you're trying to think of a specific word and it's right at the tip of your tongue. You have to stop trying for a moment, do something else, let your brain run in the background. At least that's how it is for me, but look at all I've accomplished. Maybe I'm not one to take advice from. He pulled the curtains and raised the blinds. The sudden brightness was dizzying. Yes, look at all you've accomplished. I was suddenly emotional. It's beautiful. This was once a real town, where real people lived their lives. There was happiness and beauty and mundanity. Yes, the simple everyday moments that define life. And there was evil and hurt and suffering, and all of those, yes, they're necessary too. But you forgot us. You stopped thinking of us, and gradually we've waned. We've dwindled, and the weakest of us, those of us who were hardly here to begin with, the background characters, the extras, are nearly gone. Look at them. They're senseless. They've forgotten who they were because who they were hardly mattered to begin with. We're only here, he said, pointing down at second chances, because there was more for us to lose. We remain because it takes longer for a dark stain to fade, but fade it does, eventually. I find myself waking up in the morning confused, unsure of who I am, or when it is, or where this place is. I don't want to be like them, he said, choking up. If that's what you've decided for me, then kill me now. Harold grabbed the pen and put it in my hand. Write it on that fucking paper. Harold died in his sleep peacefully. Give me the dignity of a graceful exit. I can't remain here alone in this empty world. Soon they'll all be gone, and the trees and the lake and the birds have already vanished, and I'll be all that remains. Because you started with me. I have the most of you in me. I can't do that. I can't be alone here. I'm not killing you. Do you know how time moves for us? Did you check the time when you got out? When I evaporated and reanimated back in this fucking inn? The date? I bet an hour hasn't even passed out there. Minutes at most. How long has it been since you've written of us? Do you even know? Nearly 10 years, I said, shrinking away from him. Try thousands, he said, for us. I'm sorry. There's no need to be sorry, he said, closing my hand around the pen. Write us. Bring us to life. We sat in silence for minutes. Those minutes rolled together with the same impassive, inevitable force they always do, becoming an hour and then another. The quality of the light was changing in the room as the sun climbed over our heads and began its descent on the other side of the building. I couldn't write with him watching me, but something in his posture, in the incontrovertible stare with which he fixed me, told me that asking him to leave was no longer an option. He intended to see my end of the promise delivered. I wrote a sentence of no significance, just something to get my hand moving. I paused again, thinking of how to turn this first sentence into a paragraph, and that paragraph into a page. Harold leaned forward, curious to see my words. I crowded the page with my shoulder. The delay between the first and second sentences was shorter than the length of time I needed when first pulling up to the desk and putting the first word down, but extensive still. I could feel his impatience. The gap between sentences 2 and 3 was shorter still, and my efforts progressed at this same exponential pace until I was struggling to keep my wrist from cramping and my handwriting from abandoning the limited structural integrity it began with. I lost track of where I was. It was a familiar feeling, one I'd grown out of love with, falling into the page. And coming home to it was like embracing an early lover, one who taught me to move in the right way, to breathe at the right pace, and held my hand through the multitude of mistakes natural to a beginner. It's only now, in reflection, that the irony strikes me so clearly. Of all the times I floated away, left my room and my desk and my paper, and fell into the world of my creation. This was the one time where there was literal truth to the sentiment. I slapped the pen on the desk as if it were a hot stone, and one more second of holding it would sear my flesh, and pushed the paper away. "Done?" Harold asked. The sun had gone down entirely. At some point he'd stood and turned on the lamp above the desk. It cast me in a small puddle of light, the only source in the room. His face was an ominous shadow where he sat on the edge of the bed. "Let's go," I said, taking my keys. He followed me through the door. I didn't stop to wonder then, as I should have, if he already knew the ending despite my futile efforts to keep my words concealed as I wrote them. Were my words immediately sent to his mind? It was his story I was writing, his fate I was deciding. So I thought. We traced the same path, all growing beyond familiarity and becoming monotony, back to the car, and drove the same way, avoiding Dennis, to the woods which would set us free. We parked at the tree line. He looked confused, causing me to think that simply putting it on paper did not make the next move apparent to Harold. He still needed to live it to find out. I got out of the car. "You're driving," I said. "Agency, it's important. You need to make it happen. It can't happen to you." He nodded and hopped behind the wheel. We drove into the dark forest, our headlights illuminating the night as we bounded through each curve and bounced along the pockmarked path. I could see the end up ahead, the place where we left Kadesh and returned to reality. And this time, it felt different. I smiled, happy that I had, for once, figured it out and written to the ending and not given up. I could feel the boundary pressing down into us as we crossed it, the threshold fighting to stop us from leaving. "You feel that?" I asked him, a triumphant shout in my voice. "No," he said, grinning. "I don't feel anything." The last I saw of Harold was that knowing grin as I faded from the car. When I realized I was in Harold's Inn, when the reality of my mistake came crashing down upon me, I immediately rushed upstairs to the room with the desk and the paper and the pen. My draft was gone. All that remained were blank pages. Simple enough, I told myself. Change it. Sit down and change it. I sat in that room all night, starting and stopping, balling up the first page and throwing it across the room, then starting over, trying again, scraping together attempt after attempt. It was futile. I could write one paragraph, maybe two at best, before the words would start to trade places. They would switch and rearrange themselves as soon as I'd look away. It was impossible to complete even one page. It's against the rules here, that must be it. We can't write ourselves out. I've been in Cadesh for 4 years, give or take a week or two. It took a while before I decided to start keeping track of time. If what Harold told me is true, he's only been out there, in my world, the real one, for days, not long enough to have forgotten us, which comes first. It must, before I can try to make him remember, before I can draw him back and trick him into releasing me, the way he pulled me back. I feel fortunate that my writing, before he left me here, has revived the town. People are alive, once again. They go to work every day and to shops, and kids go to school. How long before they start to wane again? How long until the birds fall out of the sky? I spend my time maintaining the inn and watching for Dennis. Like the townspeople, he is much sharper too, now. How long until it is just us two? At night, when I lay down to sleep, I think of Harold. I think of him driving my car out of the woods, smiling. I wonder if he moved into my home or if he found one of his own. I wondered how he spends his time. The things our imaginations conjure are not entirely intangible. What upsets me most is that I can no longer remember if I wrote Harold or if he wrote me. I fear we've been doing this dance, trading places, one of us always in Cadesh, while the other sits in the real world, setting traps, writing blog posts, for instance, for decades, centuries, perhaps. I shudder to think of the breadcrumbs he's dropping at this very moment. It's imperative you do it immediately while you still remember, because he will forget. I know he will. We always do. I do my best to dream of Harold, because dreams are the only place where he and I can cross paths for now. One day, many years from now, for him, centuries perhaps, for me, he will forget me. He will forget all of us, and he will dream a familiar face, that of someone he could swear he once knew, or at least imagined. And he will come looking for me. I have to believe he will look for me, that he will find me. And when he does, I'll know him. He will not know me. Not until it's too late. Wow. What an absolutely spectacular story. Some of my favorite stories on the channel are the more ethereal ones. World building, time building these characters. Stitched Apart just came out a couple weeks ago. When I'm recording this, it came out yesterday, and a lot of you loved it. And that was another story that was just very ethereal, and I loved it. And this one's very similar. This is a very special story, and I read it the best I could. And I hope I did a good job, and I hope the editing is great. Thank you so much to the author for letting me read this. I hope you all enjoyed it. I think it was spectacular. The plot was so interesting, and I was very unsure of how it was gonna go. The disappearing thing at the end when he left the tree line, the trap, was very interesting. I kind of wanted a happier ending for them both, but we take is what it is, I guess. It was, I think the most impressive thing was that he created living characters with only two characters. One of the worlds were lifeless and purposeless, and that was part of the writing rather than being a new writer who doesn't know how to build a scene or build a world. And it was just so very well done. So super big props to the author. This was very, very well done. Again, thank you for letting me read it, and I hope you all enjoyed hearing it. I'll see you in the next one. Ego Volt Anima Vestra.